Nearly 2 years ago, I launched the first episode of Project Combat, a series that analyzes EOC's long-standing fundamental issues while exploring possible design solutions. Today, I'll be analyzing Jagex's response to this series, Necromancy, the newest combat style. Welcome to Project Combat. Project Combat's influence on combat discussions among the RuneScape community, content creators, and developers has blown me away. To this day, I see comments that reference concepts explored in different episodes. Jagex has clearly embraced Project Combat's feedback. We've seen tons of little changes to combat this past year that are directly influenced by this series. Things like the new dive ability, changing Surge to require agility, and the recently reworked basic abilities like Rack and Piercing Shot are all examples of these improvements. But these are all small steps, which are great and absolutely needed. I've always felt Jagex needed to take a more dramatic step towards improving combat though. Then Jagex drops the Necromancy skill reveal. Necromancy is an entirely new combat style whose main purpose is to serve as a combat clean slate, a playground for developers to build up a combat experience within the main game that isn't constrained by the foundational problems of EOC. Necromancy's design is clearly a direct response to the decade-old problem that is EOC, and I'm so excited to talk about it. I'll also talk about the future of combat later on. Necromancy's design has some game-changing implications for what could be an upcoming combat rework. Let's recap some of Project Combat's major topics. Episode 1 was a bit of an all-over-the-place episode. It talked about user experience and readability issues, but mostly served as a generic warning that said, hey, combat needs a lot of help. Episode 2 focused on agility and mobility, but its true purpose was showcasing how progression should tie into RuneScape's unique skilling system, and how to smoothen out that player progression curve by providing clear milestones as unlocks. Episode 3 talked about accuracy and hit chance, and how that system just doesn't feel very good. Episode 4 explored complexity and depth, topics like switchscape and combat mastery. What does it mean to be a master of combat in RuneScape, and how can that journey towards mastery be fun and intuitive? Episode 5 explored player fantasy, thematics, and satisfaction. Do you feel good about combat? Do your abilities make sense with each other, and are you fulfilling a particular player fantasy when you're experiencing combat? If you already watched the Necromancy reveal, it's immediately obvious how Necromancy's design has all of these topics in mind at its core. The conversations we've all had as a result of Project Combat has heavily influenced Necromancy's design. If you haven't watched a detailed video on Necromancy, I recommend you give those a quick review first, as I won't be going over the skill in detail. Let's go over how Necromancy is addressing many of combat's long-standing issues. Also keep in mind Necromancy is still in development, so lots can change. I haven't had a chance to try Necromancy myself, so this is based solely off the information that's been provided through videos and Jagex themselves. Also Jagex, seriously? You didn't invite Project Combat to playtest a new combat skill? That is depression, but it's fine, I get it. My feedback can be harsh at times, but it's always been honest and meaningful, and I'm really happy to hear that lots of players had a chance to try it out and provide you with feedback. We'll start with player fantasy and theme. Necromancy as a combat skill immediately has a very strong theme. Things like the undead, souls, afterlife all offer lots of guidance and foundation for its function and abilities. You can already guess from the skill name alone that you'll have a combat ability that raises the dead to fight for you, and it does. Necromancy's abilities that have been revealed so far all stick to its theme, and their functionality is consistent with that theme. For example, an ability allows you to store a soul stack. Other abilities let you expend those soul stacks to do different things. And it makes thematic sense that a necromancer manipulates souls to empower their abilities. The more souls they collect, the stronger those abilities are. So Necromancy's gameplay appropriately reflects its theme, and I'm sure you feel like a necromancer when using those abilities. So Necromancy has a great foundation for player fantasy. Awesome! Next up is combat complexity, depth, and mastery. Necromancy has a core design philosophy of easy to use, hard to master. This means lower complexity and higher depth, a good foundation. Necromancy is meant to be simple to understand, but players should have access to interesting tools that can be used in skillful ways. Players can express their mastery and skill through optimal usage of those combat tools, where that optimization feels intuitive and rewarding. This is a good step towards accessible combat while also providing something exciting for skilled players. Necromancy also removes the clunky, classic auto attack and replaces it with an ability that is automatically used if you don't input any abilities. Immediately, this is a huge improvement on combat complexity, and removes the need for Revolution to exist. The clunky weirdness that comes with auto attacks is just gone, and Revolution feels less necessary because your basic deal damage ability is happening without input. Using an ability feels more meaningful because every ability either has a significant effect or a meaningful cost. It should feel weird to use Revolution with Necromancy because every ability cast should be intentional and purposeful, and come from player decisions and combat. Necromancy also cleans up ability definitions. Concepts like threshold abilities were always confusing and too restrictive to design around for developers. Instead, Necromancy offers abilities with more varied adrenaline costs. Players build adrenaline with their auto attack and intentionally expend it to use interesting abilities. Necromancy also avoids a lot of the inherent problems with adrenaline by introducing another resource that is expended to use ultimate abilities. In general, giving players more resources to manage adds depth as there's tons of decision making around how to gather and use those different resources. But the resource itself and how to use it seem pretty straightforward. Low complexity, high depth. Necromancy is clearly trending towards less inputs overall, but increasing the thought behind each input. Having less inputs throughout combat reduces complexity, but if each of those inputs requires a lot more player decision making, we're actually increasing combat depth and skill expression opportunities. I'll have to wait for the final Necromancy release to really assess this piece, but the design intent is very well structured. Necromancy introduces talents as a new progression component. This system is a clever way to let the player customize their mastery journey and drip feed complexity to give players a chance to understand Necromancy better as they level up. This is a much smoother player mastery journey, allowing players to get stronger in thematically interesting ways through lore and content, and unlock tools that are more interesting than simply hitting harder. Overall, this is a much better approach than the currently awkward upgrade pattern of greater abilities. And this gives players meaningful goals to reach while encouraging them to continue mastering combat. Next up, hit chance and accuracy. A much needed improvement, Necromancy uses a different accuracy system that gets rid of random misses on your target and adopts a system similar to Episode 3's design. This is one of many design decisions that's improving the overall satisfaction of Necromancy as a combat style compared to existing styles. I'm really excited to see more changes like this applied to the rest of the game. These are all the major points that stuck out to me and felt were worth giving a shout out to. Necromancy's new approach to combat is super exciting. It's experimenting with fundamental changes to combat aimed at making it more accessible and fun for players, while still providing those highly skilled folks a meaningful journey to mastery. Obviously, the intention here isn't to dumb down combat. Rather, this approach to combat design can actually increase the skill ceiling in more interesting ways than EOC does today. Combat skill expression should manifest in ways other than just memorization of unintuitive interactions, and Necromancy has its sights set on just that. Of course, this wouldn't be Project Combat if it was all praise, so let's go over some of my concerns with Necromancy based on the information revealed so far. My first concern is that combat is still fundamentally janky outside of combat styles and ability sets. Things like targeting, buff and debuff icons, status and health bars, combat interfaces, area of effect mechanics, visual effects and animations, hit splats, and other systems that mostly affect combat readability are still problematic. Necromancy sits on top of these systems that all need a serious cleanup, meaning Necromancy can still feel clunky and unintuitive for new or returning players who were confused by combat's poor readability. I don't want Necromancy's good combat design held back by an unsupportive hit splat system or confusing targeting mechanics and interfaces. For Necromancy to really succeed, these systems need a serious review, and Jagex should aim to clean up as many of them as possible on or before Necromancy's release. My second concern has to do with Necromancy as a damage type. Necromancy introduces a new damage type, Necromancy Damage, alongside new prayers that work with Necromancy Damage, and a new damage bonus specifically for Necromancy Damage. That means that Necromancy Damage is unaffected by any existing protection prayers. This is the one Necromancy design decision that I feel pretty strongly against. A new damage type, new prayers, and new set of bonuses feels a bit forced and awkward given the existing combat ecosystem. Necromancy weirdly sits outside of the existing combat triangle, which is a well-established concept in RuneScape. While the combat triangle itself is a bit dated as a concept, Necromancy existing outside of it just feels wrong. The concept of a combat triangle can be modernized, but Necromancy basically says, screw the triangle, I have zombies. And Necromancy Damage in its current design disrupts what we know about the combat triangle in a way that doesn't create a new foundation or design philosophy that can be extended into future combat improvements. Because of this, I'm not convinced there's enough value in creating an entirely new damage type with new prayers and separating Necromancy from the combat triangle to justify its weirdness. It doesn't feel like it's adding anything meaningful to the game other than to serve as a means to separate any existing magic damage boosting content and gear from Necromancy. A new damage type has a lot of tech debt associated with it. You kind of have to create new prayers, and any other content that exists for each combat style now needs some sort of fourth variation. I understand we wouldn't want something like Sunshine to work on Necromancy abilities, but I feel like there's a more elegant solution to this issue. One that doesn't disrupt the well-established combat triangle concept and introduce unnecessary work. Here's how I would implement Necromancy's new damage type. We already have a well-established but forgotten system in RuneScape to handle damage subtypes. Melee has Stab, Slash, and Crush, and in the past, certain gear provided specifically Stab, Slash, and Crush bonuses. Necromancy could work within this established and familiar system of subtypes, while also opportunistically redesigning that system for a modern take on subtypes. Necromancy could fall under the class of magic damage, and would instead introduce new subtypes of magic damage, for example Necrotic and Spirit. Magic would now have 6 subtypes: Fire, Water, Earth, and Air, and Necrotic and Spirit, with the 4 elemental subtypes belonging to the well-known Magic combat style, and Necrotic and Spirit belonging to the Necromancy combat style. Necromancy damage would still be classified as magic damage and respect all existing rules around magic damage, so it would be blocked by Protect from Magic, and existing magic prayers would work with Necromancy, assuming they increase your magic damage and not magic level. You could then modify existing magic content like Sunshine to only work when used with elemental magic subtypes, or have gear that specifically only provides bonuses to elemental subtypes or necromancy subtypes. This means that existing magic damage gear could either be general magic damage, which would affect all magic substyles, or specify elemental or necrotic bonuses. Again, substyles aren't a new concept for RuneScape. Pre-EOC we had separate bonuses for Stab, Slash, and Crush as substyles under Melee, and gear could provide bonuses for specific subtypes. Substyles exist within the well-known combat triangle, which makes adding a new subtype more intuitive. Necromancy then becomes an opportunity to expand the subtype system to account for subtype style bonuses, allowing for a more natural and familiar separation of gear and content among subtypes. This lets Necromancy fit naturally within the game's existing combat systems and creates opportunities and reward space for new and existing subtypes and combat styles, which I'll go over when I talk about the future of combat. Let's talk about the talent system. It's not a bad system in its current state, and it definitely serves the progression fantasy need, but to me it feels like a missed opportunity to add some depth and variance to Necromancy. At level 120 Necromancy, you'll have all the talents active at the same time. In most games with talent systems, players have to choose their talents, and that is considered to be their loadout for a combat encounter. That's kind of what makes it a talent system. You choose to be talented at some things. Talent systems let players customize their combat experience and add some depth to combat by forcing the player to make meaningful choices before going into combat. For example, a talent system can provide the player the option to choose only one of 3 very powerful ultimate abilities. Of course, talent choices wouldn't be permanent. You could change your loadout at any time, just not in the middle of a boss fight. But there's a missed opportunity here to give players more meaningful choice and allow for different playstyles of Necromancy to exist using a talent system. Choice is good and adds both depth and complexity, assuming there aren't objectively correct choices. I'm hoping Jagex expands the talent system in the future to create opportunities for different Necromancy builds. Let's talk about the auto attack ability. Necromancy's auto attack ability is a great concept, although I'm actually a little disappointed at just how basic it is. It functions as a damage filler and adrenaline builder, which, again, is totally fine, but there's a lot of space here to make a combat style's auto ability a bit more interesting. For example, in the future, maybe we get a new Necromancy weapon type, and that weapon type has its own auto attack ability that does different things. Because Necromancy is experimental, I'm okay with how simple it is for now, but I'm hoping auto attack abilities become a bit more interesting than just dealing damage every 1.8 seconds. I also wanted to touch on animations, visual effects, and sound design as well. Jagex did mention there's an ability that looks and sounds different based on how many souls were expended on its use, which is awesome to hear. But because the game has a fundamentally clunky animation, visual effect, and sound system, I do want Jagex to be mindful that visually and audibly, Necromancy feels like a high-quality, satisfying combat experience. Abilities should look and feel good, reflect what they're doing in combat through how they look and sound, and offer appropriate cues to players to communicate what's happening with combat. Player satisfaction and readability are really high priority. And that's pretty much it. I don't have too many concerns with Necromancy right now, although that might change once I get a chance to try it. It has a really strong foundation for modernizing combat in RuneScape, and I'm excited to give it a try. A big congratulations to the dev team behind Necromancy. I'm very intrigued by it, and I'm impressed by its design philosophies. At the start of this video, I mentioned Necromancy's design as a combat style actually has very game-changing implications. Let's talk about the future of combat with Necromancy. First, What even is a combat style? Necromancy is a new combat style, something we haven't seen since ever. We've had combat skills like summoning added, but never a combat style. How is a combat style defined though? Necromancy actually answers this question formally. Let's first recall an idea I threw around in my player fantasy video. One of the issues I have with combat thematics is the lack of playstyle variety and thematics with abilities. Whether you're using a bow, a crossbow, or a throwing weapon, you're using the exact same set of ranged abilities in the same way. I felt like each weapon style should have their own separate set of unique abilities so that combat with a bow feels distinct to combat with a crossbow. A bow is thematically and functionally different from a throwing weapon, so they shouldn't share a set of abilities. If we apply this logic to Necromancy, it could have easily been introduced as a new sub-style within Magic. Jagex could have introduced all these new Necromancy combat abilities as magic abilities, introduced a new Necromancy weapon as a magic weapon, and require that weapon to use these new abilities. Swap ability books at a Necromancy altar and boom, Necromancy is introduced as a new combat style, but as a subset of magic, just like different abilities for bows versus throwing weapons. And this would work perfectly fine for Necromancy, except for one major problem. Players are already 99 magic. If Necromancy was introduced as a subset of magic, there wouldn't be enough for players to get excited about because most of Necromancy would be unlocked for players on day one. If you think about other class-based games, when a new way to engage in standard combat, or a new combat style, is introduced, it tends to be a new class. And new class releases are exciting moments that brings players back to experience the game in a new way through a new approach to combat. That's exactly what Necromancy is. It's a new class for RuneScape, a new combat style. But RuneScape is designed around skills, so it's being introduced as a new skill. And new skills are exciting for players, which makes a ton of sense. Based on Necromancy's design as a new skill, a combat style can be summarized as a cohesive set of unique combat abilities under a unique skill, which can be used independently of another combat style's abilities to engage in standard combat. Under this definition, ranged and magic are combat styles. You can exclusively use magic combat abilities and engage in combat effectively with just those abilities. Defense would not be a combat style since you can't engage in standard combat by just using defense abilities. You have to combine defense abilities with a combat style to make meaningful combat progress across the game, and the same goes for hit points, prayer, and summoning. Necromancy is a unique set of combat abilities under a unique skill, which can be used independently of another combat style's abilities to engage in standard combat. Therefore, it's a new combat style, and that new combat style is being specifically introduced as a new skill. But it's not Necromancy damage, the new prayers, or new weapons that make Necromancy a new combat style. It's solely the new set of combat abilities that work with each other. And here we have a very interesting implication for the future of RuneScape combat. Introducing a new set of combat abilities that together form a new way to experience combat and can be used to standard effect without having to involve another combat style is implicitly a new skill. But melee is an odd exception to this combat style definition. It's a combat style that's made up of two unique skills, attack and strength, and you can't get too far with melee if you ignore one of those skills. Attack and strength stick out as an awkward legacy issue. Why is melee made up of two combat skills? It's made very little sense ever since EOC. Jagex has explored possible solutions to the attack and strength problem for a while. Do you combine them into a melee skill? Do you make attack or strength a universal combat skill for all four styles? None of these solutions ever really worked out in practice, but Necromancy has changed the game, because Necromancy indirectly solves a major problem with combat styles. They feel too similar, and there's a lack of design space for different combat themes within a combat skill. As I've mentioned a few times, combat styles tend to have very singular playstyles regardless of your weapon choice. And this is particularly obvious in the mid-game. Each existing combat style only has one set of abilities, one theme, one playstyle. If you're using a dragon 2H sword, your combat experience really isn't much different from using dual-wielding dragon scimitars. Your DPS is about the same, you use mostly the same abilities, and this similarity is even worse for ranged magic, where the difference between a bow and a crossbow is almost nothing. Endgame weapons can be an exception, of course, through special attacks and passive effects, but they don't solve the core issue with abilities and playstyles. Necromancy introduces a strong definition for what a combat style is, and we can use this to solve a few fundamental problems with combat. Think about it this way. What if attack and strength were two entirely separate combat styles that exist and function independently, with separate sets of unique abilities that offer distinct playstyles? Attack could be the combat style that supports dual wielding, and only has dual wielding abilities. Attack would then become its own unique combat style, with its own theme, and a playstyle that fits within that theme. For example, fast and frequent hits with lots of mobility, a dual wielding experience. Strength could become the combat style that supports two-handed weapons, and only has two-handed abilities. Strength becomes its own unique combat style with its own theme, and a playstyle that fits within that theme. Slow, hard-hitting weapons that emphasize brute force. What if we wanted to add bows and crossbows as different playstyles, with different abilities? The solution is now obvious. We would add a new skill. Range would become the skill for bows and offer bow abilities and a bow-centric playstyle. We could then introduce an entirely new combat skill that exists for crossbows, with a unique set of abilities and a playstyle designed specifically for crossbows. This is exactly what Necromancy did. Instead of being a subset of magic, it was introduced as an entirely new skill that focuses specifically on the Necromancy theme, with a new set of abilities for Necromancy weapons only. Necromancy being introduced this way has set up Jagex for the future of combat, which is really exciting. This is also why I feel Necromancy damage should just be classified as magic damage with two new subtypes of Necrotic and Spirit. It would retain the combat triangle as we know it, but allow for new combat styles to be introduced as sub-styles within the combat triangle. And different gear would specifically provide bonuses for particular sub-styles. For example, maybe an armor set only provides bonuses for arrow damage or bolt damage. In any case, Necromancy lays out the groundwork for introducing new combat styles to RuneScape. So, what could the future of combat look like? There's an obvious next step here. Taking all combat styles to 120 to match Necromancy, and couple that with a rework that gives the other combat styles similar design philosophies to Necromancy, with some variations of course. That means 120 attack, strength, range, and magic. It also becomes a great opportunity to change strength and attack to be their own unique combat styles that exist independent of each other and provide entirely different ways to experience melee combat like I described earlier. Jagex could even use this as an opportunity to introduce a new combat style as mentioned earlier, by changing range to work with bows and introducing a new combat skill for throwing weapons or crossbows, with each having their own unique playstyles and combat abilities. By treating new combat styles as new skills, and recognizing the potential for new approaches to combat and themes that exist within our existing skills, means combat can grow endlessly, and players can always look forward to new ways to engage with PvM content. And naturally, the more players there are to be engaged with PvM content, and the better those fundamental combat designs are, encourages Jagex to continue creating new PvM content that can be both challenging and exciting for a much larger portion of the RS player base. I want to thank everybody for being a part of Project Combat. The results of our conversations are obvious. Also a huge congratulations and thank you to all the Jagex developers that have connected with myself and the community and accepted our passionate feedback on combat, and applied it to Necromancy's design. As it stands right now, I'm pretty confident the future of combat in RuneScape is very bright. It might be a couple years off, but Jagex is making big strides towards a fun combat system, and I look forward to giving Necromancy a try later this year. Of course, we're not quite done with Project Combat just yet. Necromancy doesn't solve every issue, and there's still a couple major topics to discuss, particularly defense and prayer. Damage mitigation in RuneScape is still busted, but we'll talk about that in the next episode. Thank you for watching.